Welcome to everyone. It's very good to see so many of you here. It's a real treat, both an honor and a delight to welcome you to the event in honor of the publication of Professor Anna Sapir Abulafia's second edition of a very important book. So I'm just going to say two words of introduction and then turn it over to Professor Abulafia, who will explain more about the book and the publication and why this is, she won't put it in these terms, but why this is such an important moment for the field. First, I'll just tell you, as you probably know, that Anna Sapir Abulafia is Professor Emerita of the study of Abrahamic religions at the University of Oxford. She's a fellow of the British Academy and an international authority on the medieval Christian-Jewish debate. The main focus of her research is the interaction of medieval Christianity and Judaism within the broad context of 12th and 13th century theological and ecclesiastical developments. She was fellow college lecturer and director of studies at Lucy Cavendish College in Cambridge and also at Newnham College. And then in April of 2015, took up the chair of the study of Abrahamic religions in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford, becoming the first incumbent of that chair. A very important moment actually in the history of our fields, where she became a fellow of Lady Margaret Hall until her retirement in September of 2022. I should have said that my name is Aaron Kohler and I am a senior research fellow at the Oxford Interfaith Forum, but that's much less important than what I'm about to say anyway. For everyone in the field, this new and revised edition of Professor Abulafia's book, Christian-Jewish Relations, 1000 to 1300, Jews in the Service of Medieval Christendom, and I think that title packs a punch, is an exciting moment. The book covers a huge amount of time, 300 years, huge amount of space, England, Spain, France, Germany, and a wide range of topics: theology, social history, economic history, political history. Professor Abulafia uses Latin and Hebrew sources intensively and extensively, including liturgies, exegetical works, narratives, polemics, legal sources, all bring them together to give a vivid sense of how Christians interacted with Jews and how Jews interacted with Christians. And I think I have said enough. Let me turn it over to Professor Abulafia, and we're really excited to celebrate the publication.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. That's more than I deserve in terms of warmth. Thank you so much. When I published my book, came out, I finished it in 2009, it came out in 2011. After a few years, the publishers got on to me and asked for a second edition. And I have to say my initial reaction was, enough already, I've done it, I don't want to return to it. And initially I said no, but they were persistent. And obviously that was flattering, but I still very much wondered whether I wanted to return what I'd already done. But in the end, I did sign a contract and I thought, well, hang on, it is important. And I will say, really speaking from the heart, we're in a period of rising anti-Semitism. It is important that this kind of material does reach a wider public. And I very much hope that in universities, this sort of topic continues to be taught. Also, a new edition, obviously I could correct mistakes that I'd made, but more exciting for me was that I could include some of the newer work that I've been doing, especially on canon law. So what I want to do in the next, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes or something, I just want to talk to you a little bit about what I'm trying to do in the book and also introduce some of that newer material. What am I really trying to do in this book? What are the two main drivers of the book? The first one is that I was looking to explain to a wider public, so not just people interested in Jewish history, that Christian encounters with Jews and Jewish encounters with Christians, these are really an integral component if you want to understand the cultural, legal development, even economic development of medieval Latin society. This isn't just an optional add-on. If you want to really get to grips with some of the really difficult aspects of medieval Latin society, it really does help to look at things through the lens of Christian-Jewish relations. Now, I knew that from my research, but more importantly, I knew that from many, many years of teaching medieval history to undergraduates. And I often, for instance, a very difficult topic, the relationship between temporal and spiritual powers, to explain that to modern students who don't always have a lot of background in these sort of issues. Once you start explaining what it meant to Jews, the spiritual, the temporal, everything became so much clearer to them. So that was a main something very important to me to do in the book. Secondly, I was looking for a synthesizing concept which could make sense of the very different experiences that different Jewish communities had within medieval Latin Christendom. So one of the things that had bugged me for so many years was, why could it be that the Jews of Iberia, let's say Sepharad, so including the Latin Mediterranean, why was their experience really very different than the experiences of the Jewish communities in northern France or England? How's that possible? It's not as if the church had a different theology in Spain from northern France or England. I wanted to somehow get my head around that. And the concept I thought would be the best to use in this is the concept of service. Now, when I'm talking about service, I'm not just thinking of the very sort of what everybody else goes on about, the theological Augustinian form of that service, nor am I looking at the idea, I think misguided idea, that somehow the position of medieval Jews was pretty much the same as medieval serfs. We have this dreadful term, chamber serfdom. That is not what I was thinking about. What I was thinking about, and the way I've handled it in the book, is to use the word service in its very many different meanings, fully in its multivalent connotations, where it can mean so many different things in different contexts. What one needs to do is not just to use the word service in a kind of blanket way. One needs to look at the nature of service. What was it exactly under this concept of service that Jews were required to do at different times, in different places, and in different settings? Because once you start asking yourself about the nature of service, you realize very quickly service can be very honorable, it can be neutral, it can, of course, be incredibly degrading. The service of an enslaved person is horrible, it's dreadful. But when we think in the British sense of the civil service, my goodness, there's nothing dishonorable about the civil service. Well, they certainly wouldn't think civil servants of themselves. They perform what they think is a very honorable position. Within Catholicism, think of the Pope. What is the Pope? He's the servus servorum Christi, the servant of Christ. What throughout Torah are Jews commanded to be? We're commanded to be the Avadim Adonai, the servants of God. So service, which is a very, very important, integral concept of the whole setup of medieval society, that when you use it to try to disentangle the different position Jews held, both in theology and economy and politics, in a social sense, I felt that that was a good way to try and get some kind of coherent narrative about the experience of Jews throughout medieval Latin Christendom, throughout Europe. And equally important, what I thought was absolutely necessary was to look at what Jews did with this concept of service that the Christian host society was using in terms of their position in that host society. So we must remember that Jewish communities, they would never have survived if they were simply there as passive players receiving whatever was thrown at them. That is not the way things worked. Jewish communities had their own agency. Things might be incredibly difficult, but they did have their own agency in how they reacted to the circumstances that they were in, but also very much within their own cultural, religious way of expressing their own and strengthening their own identity. So obviously we need to unpack this. So we will start with some theological material. So what you have on the slide is trying to put into a kind of easy way to oversee it, the Pauline and Augustinian and other patristic teachings that had put Judaism at the heart of Christian self-identity and self-validation. Very important for this is the teaching of St. Paul in Romans 11, Paul's olive tree. The root of that olive tree always remains Jewish, even though Gentile branches have been grafted onto the olive tree in place of the original Jewish ones. But again, according to the text, Jewish branches would, of course, be reconnected at the end of time. Now, what Paul himself meant at the time that he was writing is a whole separate area of research. That's not my expertise, and I'm not going there. What I'm talking about is what Paul's medieval interpreters made of Romans 11 and also of much of the other teachings of Paul throughout his epistle. Now, Paul's medieval interpreters, including Augustine, used this kind of imagery to argue that Jews practicing their faith provided continuous testimony to the validity of Christian truth claims. And we are here very much in the Augustinian witness theory, the testimonium veritatis, witness to the truth of Christianity. Now, to very much simplify it all, but just to remind everybody, in case this isn't in the forefront of what you think about, Augustine was faced with a conundrum because he was convinced that all of the teachings in the Old Testament, as he would think of it, had, of course, come to fruition in Christ, in Christ's teaching, in the death, the resurrection, and everything else. And then the big problem is, well, hang on, if it's that clear, why can't the Jews see it? Why, Augustine would be thinking, why are Jews still around? Why are they illicit religion under the Romans? What's going on here? Augustine was facing a lot of criticism from pagans at his time who were less enamored of Christianity, to put it mildly, but also a lot of heretics who actually did not want the Old Testament to continue to be a book of validation for Christianity. And Augustine worked out a theory that Jews are useful to Christians because if pagans turned to Christians and said, well, easy peasy, you write the New Testament, you write the Old Testament. Yeah, of course, the two cohere. Augustine could say, and he actually writes this, no, you've got that wrong. Look at the Jews. The Jews are our enemies, his words, not mine, and they are following the rules of the Old Testament. Augustine didn't know about rabbinic Judaism, but we'll leave that for a moment. And it's therefore clear that we haven't made anything up. Jews are therefore being useful. In this Augustinian idea, Jewish dispersion demonstrated very clearly what happens to people who do not believe in Jesus, who reject Jesus Christ. They lose their land and they are they are dispersed through the empire. That also makes them extra useful because that means that they can testify to Christian validity far and wide. So let's see how this sort of thinking plays out in the 12th century. And for this, I'm turning to England. I'm turning to William of Newbury, who is writing at the end of the 12th century in a book about the history of the English. And this isn't a nice text. Many of these texts aren't nice at all, but it is useful to read it. Surely on account of the same reason of Christian utility, the perfidious Jew, the crucifier of the Lord Christ, is allowed to live among Christians, by which also the shape of the Lord's cross is depicted in the Church of Christ, namely to perpetuate the most salutary memory of the Lord's passion for all the faithful. Yet whereas we detest the impious action in the Jew, we truly worship the divine honor with fitting devotion in that sacred shape. Consequently, Jews must certainly live amongst Christians for our utility, but they must serve on account of their iniquity. So we have a very clear expression of a form of Jewish service here at the end of the 12th century. But to understand what's going on, we have to ask ourselves, what is the context in which William is writing this kind of message? So the context is the massacre in York in 1190. So in this massacre, and I'll come back to that in a second, many Jews are losing their lives. Some have taken their own life. Others are being slaughtered by Christian crusaders, by knights. William is trying to understand this. What's his problem? He's appalled. He doesn't think this is right at all. But according to William's idea of history, this is God's will. How on earth can this be God's will? And what we need to be able to understand his thinking, we need to just step back a moment and remind ourselves about what the Jews were doing in England. So they come with the Conqueror, 1066, from Rouen, and William the Conqueror seems to have wanted to benefit from them, if you like, use them, and he did that by their business in plate and silver. I don't have time to go into all of this, but Jews started out their life from 1066 onwards very much as traders in plate. It is really only in the 1180s onwards, because of what Henry II is doing with Anglo-Saxon English money lending. He's putting the lid on that, and Henry II starts encouraging Jewish money lending from the 1180s. So Jews are able to step in, if you like, in a gap in the market from the 1180s. And what is going on here is that Henry, the crown, is no longer borrowing from the Jews. The crown is making its money by taxing Jews on the money they make from money lending. Unfortunately, in the medieval period, charging of any kind of interest was seen as usury, which is a very pejorative word now in our modern parlance, but this is the way that charging of interest was regarded. So in the eyes of somebody like William of Newbury, the king getting income by charging taxes on Jews who are engaged in money lending, what are the Jews? They are, as he calls it, the king's usurers. The problem is who is serving whom? What is the relationship between a lender and the borrower? Who has more clout, the lender or the borrower? And that is what is very much bugging him. What he is seeing, and we go back to trying to work out why on earth God can allow all these horrible killings to go on. What he is saying is, look, the crown has done badly. The crown is allowing Jews to do this sort of thing. And the right relationship between the Christian subjects of the king and the Jews of England, that has been inverted because through money lending, Jews have too much power over Christians. Now, what Henry II does, and future kings in England, by supporting the money lending, they do well out of it for a while. Some Jews, many Jews not, did well out of it as well. But the ambiguity, and ambiguity is a word that I use constantly in my book. The ambiguity, of course, is this means that Jews are completely dependent on the goodwill of the crown. If the crown is favorable and treats them well, that's great. But if the crown decides to treat the Jews badly, obviously that is not good at all. And we see very quickly already in 1186 how this plays out. Aaron of Lincoln, a very successful Jewish money lending, when he dies in 1186, his estate is immediately confiscated by the crown. And for the borrowers of Aaron of Lincoln, that is not nice at all, because it's one thing to be indebted to Aaron of Lincoln. It's quite another to be indebted to the crown. That's much more scary. And the crown chased those debts ruthlessly. So the York Massacre, just in a few words, we're looking at the run-up to the Third Crusade. We're just after the coronation of Richard I in September 1190. For all kinds of reasons, there are riots against the Jews in London at that time. Those riots spread throughout England. They reach York in March in 1190. The Jews of York seek their refuge in Clifford's Tower in the castle. Masses of misunderstandings, but at a certain point, the Jews know that they just have no hope. And many of the Jews decide to self-martyr themselves, commit suicide, self-martyr is a better term, and set the tower alight. Other Jews decide that they do that they are prepared to convert, to save their lives, and they are hacked down by the crowd outside as they leave. There's a reason why William of Newbury is absolutely appalled at the bloodshed. What do the knights do who are involved in all of this? They go straight to York Minster, where we would now say the paperwork, the parchments recording the debts are, and they set light to it in the church so that the debts are no longer recorded. Now, obviously, this is extremely bad news for the Jews, but on the other hand, ambiguity, the same Richard I, who did not want all of this to happen, but did not stop it. He wasn't around. There was a vacuum of authority in York at this period. Richard was in Normandy preparing the crusade. But when he gives a charter to the Jews, he goes back to the sorts of things his father, his grandfather promised the Jews, and the Jews are promised that they are allowed to reside freely and honorably in England and Normandy. So in this sense, this is not dishonorable service. Now let's go to another example of how theology and economics can be combined. We have here Bernard of Clairvaux. We're in the Second Crusade when it was being preached, and he was, of course, one of the great preachers, obviously great 12th century theologian, and he was abbot, Cistercian abbot. He is very angry that one of his monks, Ralph, is going around preaching that Jews should be slaughtered. And he writes to far and wide to say, this is absolutely not true, mustn't happen. He uses the Augustinian language, going back to Psalm 58, Vulgate 59 in Hebrew Bible, where slay them not. This must not happen. Again, the Jews are the living letters of Scripture. Jews are unceasingly reminding Christians of the Lord Passion. In other words, leave them alone. Pretty emotive language. I mean, to be protected by having somebody constantly say, boy, you're being your reminder of the Passion, I mean, you can, it's very loaded stuff. Also very loaded is that in the same correspondence, what Bernard does, he's not just talking about theological service, he's talking about economic service. And he says, look, we need to preserve the Jews because if there aren't any Jews, we'll have more Christians becoming money-lending. Very unfortunately, to put it mildly, he uses the word judaizare, Judaize, as the verb for to lend money or to charge interest, or not to put too fine a point on it, to be a usurer. So here we have Bernard, who really does protect Jews from being killed in 1146, and he really stuck his neck out to do that. At the same time, he establishes a very damaging stereotype of Jews, a stereotype that really never has gone away. He also teaches that Crusaders should not pay interest on their loans to Jews, just as the Pope had said that that Crusaders should not have to pay interest from money that they borrowed from Christian moneylenders. Now, what do our Jewish sources make of that? And we have for our Jewish sources Ephraim of Bonn. And Ephraim of Bonn, in his Sefer Zechirah, his book of remembrance, he gives a great deal of information on what is going on in Jewish communities in the 12th century. And reading from the text, Ephraim writes, "The Lord heard our outcry. He sent a decent priest." I mean, for Ephraim to praise a priest, I mean, that is just quite something. It's not something he would easily do. So he's pleased with Bernard, and he actually says, you know, Bernard didn't even ask money to do this. So he really does, he's grateful to what Bernard has done. Whoever touches a Jew to take his life is like one who harms Jesus himself. From the book of Psalms it is written, slay them not. So here we have Ephraim knowing about what Bernard is doing, and also knowing the Christian theological argument why Jews should not be killed. And this is a lovely example of how much knowledge there was between the Christian and Jewish communities about each other's thoughts and teachings. What Bernard also does what Ephraim also does is that he does record that French communities lost a great deal of their wealth. And the way he understands this, and it's not what Bernard had said, he understands it that many of the Crusaders got remission for the whole debt and not just for the interest. But let's move on to Germany to see a few other things and good examples of ambiguity. So you've got a map here, and the blue stars, they show you some of the important Jewish communities which had been built up by the end of the 11th century. And you see that we are in the area of the Rhine and Cologne there in the north, and then three cities that work together a very great deal on Jewish law and all kinds of things, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And in the Jewish sources, these are the Shum communities. Also, in the Christian side of things, these episcopal cities did a great deal of work together. Regensburg, very ancient Jewish community by 1,000, and of course on the Danube. Now, really good examples of ambiguity when we get to the positions of the Jews in Germany. So in 1090, King Emperor Henry IV gives the Jews of Speyer and Worms the most amazingly generous charters. I mean, just really charters one can only dream of for. 6 years later, only 6 years later, the Jews of these cities and in Cologne and Mainz and Regensburg are attacked by the Crusaders. First Crusade, 1096, these are not the official armies. We don't have time to go into this. It's another group of Crusaders. And what then is so clear, and it's something I talk a lot about in the book, and something which I think is of essential importance, That is the role of authority. The role of authority of those who have jurisdiction over Jews. What do I mean by this? Jews of Speyer and Worms may have had these fantastic charters from the emperor, but when they are being attacked, that doesn't help them. Henry IV was in Italy. He had other things on his mind. What matters is who is there on the ground in their cities, and do these people have authority? Are they able to protect the Jews, and do they want to? The two things have to come together. We see it very clearly. In Speyer, Bishop John, he had the authority, and he wanted to exercise the authority. He does protect the Jews. Speyer, we have the least deaths in the Rhineland, only 11 deaths, which is much lower count than in the other cities. Worms? Nope. In Worms, the bishop was not an ally of the king. Speyer, the bishop, was not in Worms. We're not even sure the bishop of Worms was in Worms at the time of the attacks. And in Worms, the Jewish communities are decimated. So combination of things can be, you have these good charters. The problem is what happens when attacks happen on the ground. But there is a very rapid recovery. It's one of the most amazing things in the Jewish medieval history, how quickly these communities managed to pull themselves together. It is quite extraordinary. And by 1105, in Speyer, the Jewish community is allowed by the bishop to build a beautiful new synagogue. This is what you can see if you go to Speyer today. The remains of the synagogue. This is in an area of Speyer which had been used by Christians. We know that from the archaeological remains. Nonetheless, it was given to the Jewish community to build their synagogue and to build one of these amazing mikvaot, ritual baths, very deep ritual bath. And if you look at the stones and the architecture of both the synagogue and the mikvah, you will see that there are very many similarities with the architectural details of the cathedral of Speyer, the great cathedral, the beloved cathedral of the Salian emperors, of Henry IV. If you go into the crypt of that cathedral, that's where they're all buried. It's 5 minutes around the corner from where the Jews were allowed to build their synagogue and their mikveh. And that brings us to the important thing, which I've said, is this question of Jewish agency. So we have, for very many reasons, obvious reasons, Germany has a very bad press. I mean, the shadow of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, when you're looking at the history, medieval history of Germany, it's always there, and it's very difficult not to reflect and project from our own history back into the medieval period. But one thing that is often said, but simply isn't true, not all Jews were expelled from Germany in the Middle Ages. In fact, a city of Worms, so we saw it on the map, on the Rhine, Worms had pretty much almost a continuous Jewish community to the 1930s. 1930s, it's only under the Nazis that the community ceased to exist. And a city like Regensburg on the Danube, which was founded before 1000, the Jewish community was there until 1519. And what we see clearly in Regensburg, but also in many other of these German cities, is how the Jewish communities worked out how to maneuver between the different layers of authority which are present in the German Empire. Germany never had the kind of royal control that we had in medieval England, the way that in France eventually the Capetians built up that kind of central control. That wasn't the case in Germany. There were always competing authorities left, right, and center. So when it came to Regensburg, what the Jewish community had to do was somehow play imperial authority, the authority of the Duke of Bavaria, the authority of the bishop, the authority of the citizens of Regensburg and the great monastery of St. Emmeran, to somehow maneuver themselves between all those different authorities whilst being economically very active and very useful, so that the city wanted the community to continue to exist. And Regensburg actually protected the Jews from many different onslaughts where Jews from other cities were massacred, and we don't have that in Regensburg. Now that seemed to play out and work till the 1519. Now, and just to show you, this shows an etching by Albert Altdorf in the 16th century, and he made etchings of the Gothic synagogue, which the Jews had in Regensburg, which was destroyed and no longer exists. But from this etching, we can see what kind of magnificent building it was. Now, I'm not saying there weren't expulsions in Germany. We all know that by the turn of the 14th century, there were. And of course, many of those expulsions resulted in the Jews moving eastwards, towards Bohemia, towards what we now call Eastern Europe, and building up those very strong Ashkenazi communities in that part of Europe. Also, many Jews went to Italy. But in other cases, for instance, when Nuremberg, the city of Nuremberg, expelled the Jews in 1499, the Jews went to neighboring Fürth, which then was a village in the outside of Nuremberg. Now it's simply a suburb of Nuremberg. You take the tram and you're there in a few minutes. Anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of some of the main drivers of the book. And just to say a few words about what I added in the new edition. So there's a whole new section of further reading. Obviously, a lot of extremely good and important work has been published since the first edition of 2011. I also added material on the Bible, and I also expanded the section on polemics. That was very much in response to what lecturers, professors in universities wrote to the publisher and said that would be useful for their teaching. But for me, what was more exciting than that was the opportunity to add a section on canon law. Now, canon law, of course, I mean ecclesiastical law. Now, while I was writing the book the first time round, I began to realize just how important canon ecclesiastical law was, and it just kept popping up in my research in all kinds of different ways. And since finishing the book, my big project, has been to look at canon law through the lens of Christian-Jewish relations. And I wanted to add something about that to the book, if only to demystify the topic, because it is a kind of scary topic if you're not sort of au fait with it, and to show how important it is when you're working on Christian-Jewish relation. So just a few words, and I hope I can demystify this to you in something like 5 minutes. So what I'm concentrating on is what we call Gratian's Decretum. What is Gratian's Decretum? We're in the middle of the 12th century. We're looking at a collection which pulls together in a very new, systematic way all kinds of ecclesiastical texts. So patristic texts from the church fathers, decisions from various councils, papal decisions, all that kind of stuff, brought together in a very systematic way, trying to tease out all kinds of contradictions between different texts and coming to an understanding of what the contradictions are all about. Now, the first iteration of this was completed by somebody called Gratian around 1139. Very quickly, and the work by Anders Winroth is essential for this, very quickly, this first iteration was expanded on tremendously, greatly expanded, and what we call a Vulgate version is disseminated by 1150. Now, why is the Decretum worth studying? A pivotal text, hugely disseminated. I mean, really far and wide. I mean, maybe just as much as the Bible. I think the two are very close rivals. And glossed left, right, and center, and masses of summae and overviews are produced on the Decretum. The Decretum becomes the textbook of canon law. It's what anybody going into ecclesiastical or civil service will actually study in his education. Now, you might say, okay, fine, what on earth does this have to do with Jews? Well, Jews pop up in the Decretum because Jews are constantly being referred to in patristic texts. That's just straightforward. If we think of canons which specifically deal with Jews, we're talking about canons that specifically deal with relations between Christians and Jews. That is very relevant for canon law. Very few canons about Jews in the first recension. But most of them, many of them, are there in the fuller recension. So the big question is, of course, what's going on? Why, when the first recension was amplified, why on earth did anybody find it necessary, whether it was one person or another person or a group of people, to add more and more text about Jews? Also important, the first iteration didn't have a separate section on Jews, not at all. There are very few canons about Jews, I think 5 in the whole in this very, very big work. So in the fuller version, there isn't a special text, a special section to do with Jews, not at all. It's spread through the text concerning Jews. Now, let me just give you one example so you understand what I'm talking about. There is a section of the Decretum which is talking about priesting of unfree men. Is an unfree person, a servus, is he allowed to become a priest? And you can imagine there's a text that says, no, look, you can't serve God if you're serving a temporal lord. There's another text, well, if that temporal lord frees a man, yeah, then it's possible. So all that kind of stuff. Then you have the rules, yeah, well, the freeing, it really has to be done properly because otherwise it's unclear whether the person is free enough to become a priest. Nothing to do with Jews. And you can imagine somebody teaching that. And as you're teaching that, somebody saying, oh, well, it's clear. Well, really, really important is the Lord of the temporal Lord of that unfree man. It really is up to him whether or not this unfree person can be freed so he can be priested. And you can almost see it happening. Somebody think, what? Okay, it depends on a Lord whether a Christian can be priested. Hang on, what happens if the Lord's a Jew? It can be up to a Jew whether a Christian can be a priest. Oh, Jews aren't allowed to have slaves. And what do you have inserted in the text? Canon after canon. Jews are not allowed to have slaves, and Jews are not allowed to be an authority over Christians, etc., etc. Now, it's this sort of thing that's happening. It's almost as if the person, kind of think it was one person, but maybe more than one person, working, teaching that earlier text, when it comes to Jewish things, finding loopholes that this person felt needed to be filled. The result of it is that a lot of very pejorative texts are added into a basic textbook of canon law, which was disseminated throughout medieval Latin Christendom and was studied by people who are not who are not theologians, by people who are interested in Jews, but reading a section of the Decretum which had nothing to do with Jews, they all of a sudden find their noses on very pejorative texts about Jews. Very interesting is that these texts are very much glossed on, and my work is very much on how is this read, what happens to it, and then can we see in the glosses an understanding of practical rules and regulations about Jews in the place where the particular commentators are working. Apart from all of that, looking at canon law, at the Decretum, through the lens of Christian-Jewish relations, is also actually a tool for learning more about the evolution of the Decretum, but that's something else. So finally, what I want to say, what's the point of all of this kind of work? And this is, I think, very relevant for this particular forum of interfaith discussion. I am convinced that the only way to have any of these discussions is if we face up to the difficulties of our history, our separate traditions, and I believe we have to do that with dispassionate integrity. I feel if you do this sort of work, you're not looking for villains, you're not looking for victims, you're looking for real human beings. And you have to face up to hateful material on both sides. You have to deal with it, and you have to learn from it to recognize the multiple mutations ill-feeling, hatred of the other can take. And I think that facing up to the past with all of its complicated ambiguities and contradictions is the way to do it, rather than something we unfortunately see too much nowadays, and that is the attempt to reshape the past to suit present concerns. And I hope that gives you some idea of the book and also of the second edition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Abulafia. You mentioned Augustine's Metaphors, that the Jews are milestones along the route which guide the way but remain insensible. And you alluded in your talk half an hour ago to the fact that Augustine seems to be unaware of Rabbinic Judaism. And that, I think, sets up something that you talk about in the book, where the Christian discovery of the Talmud actually challenges some of Augustine's metaphors. So this I think is quite an interesting chapter that you allude to. Could you talk a little bit about the challenge of the Talmud to Christian dogma and how they responded to it?
Yes, so I think one could say a shock to the system, because the idea that the Jews of their own time were these Old Testament Jews, but the idea that they actually had post-biblical material, which wasn't Christian material. Again, there was a lot of ambiguity, but that did shock them very much, and the Talmud shocked them. The trials of the Talmud in the 13th century, the precursors of that is polemical material, which we already have from the 12th century. And there were different reactions to it. So originally, the first thing was to find in it, and they used, the help that Christian intellectuals got from Jewish converts to Christianity is a rather sad story. They attack the Talmud for being blasphemous, for saying horrible things about the Virgin Mary and about Jesus and all that sort of thing. And so a first reaction was, must do away with it. The Jewish community successfully argued against that and said, look, hang on, going back to canon law, in canon law, we're actually allowed to be Jews, and we can only be Jews with the Talmud. So that mitigated some of that. But in my view, and this isn't everybody's view, but in my view, what happened pretty quickly, and we see it very clearly in the Talmud discussion, debate, if you like, in 1263, in Barcelona, the Talmud is being used to prove Christian truth. So just as much as the Hebrew Bible was used to validate Christianity, the Talmud was as well. So I think that it doesn't actually substantially change the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. I think that service idea still holds, but what is very much inserted, very much part of the discussion, is that Jews are dangerous, that Jews are dangerous to the Christian community. That is an aspect which then develops in all kinds of different ways, which was not good news, I mean, quite often. On the other hand, when we look at rabbinic explanation, exegesis of the Hebrew Bible, people who were interested in Hebrew, 12th, 13th century, the Hebraist, they were very keen to use that to understand better the foundation of understanding the Bible, what they would call the literal sense, the historical sense. So it's never, we're not really dealing with binaries. We have a lot of complicated ambiguities there, and in different settings, different things would be considered.
I trust everyone will join me in offering Professor Abulafia congratulations on the new edition. We're all very excited for. And thank you so much for taking the time to share the wisdom and insight with us.
Thank you very much.